We all start out knowing nothing. We all must learn and mature. Most of us do so by facing and overcoming the many, many hardships that are thrown at us. Unabomber never learned anything except math, as evidenced by the worst nonfiction book I've ever read, his Manifesto, which proves that the smartest monster is also the stupidest genius. Just example after example, all of which have just merely been islands. Today, we're going to reveal the whole world, the ultimate hypocrisy. I can't even think of one that's bigger. There might be others up on the same level, but I think this is the absolute maximum of hypocritical that you can be under the current rules of the observable universe. But first, let's finish setting the stage before we reveal it. In part one, we covered the hypocrisy of his philosophy. In part two, we went over the self-projection of his politics. And now we get the shack hobo's opinions on socialization. And you would think that Ted Kaczynski, who went from one extreme to the other as far as socialization, would have the best viewpoint on such things, because as far as being around people, he went from entering college at an early age around dozens of people at immature levels who are still learning every day, to college professor having to try to teach those immature people who are still learning, which is the ultimate in over-socialization. You can't get more among people than that, and the frustrations that ensue from doing such, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which was an isolated shack in Montana. So if he can go all the way from here to here, he must know everything in between, right? Well, somehow he seems to have just hopped right over that middle 99% and has no perspective on anything between those two extremes. As we see from this quote that I found in the Manifesto, which sums up his whole view on socialization, which is what you learn through being around other people. We suggest that over-socialization is among the more serious cruelties that human beings inflict on one another. And to summarize the next few lines, it's because it instills shame for everyday transgressions that most people commit. So if you jaywalk, you feel terrible about it. If you snub someone, you're made to feel embarrassed because of, in his opinion, over-socialization. So I think that's a strong enough argument to say over-socialization is right up there with the concentration camps, the Gulag, the Inquisition. Yeah, some innocent civilian, poor bastard from a couple hundred years ago was in an Iron Maiden, unable to move as hundreds of spikes pierced his flesh, looking through that little slot at the accusers who are only falsely accusing him so that they can get his dowry and all of his worldly earnings after he's dead, but they're throwing in this torture beforehand to make it look legitimate and have a little fun for their evil selves. I'm sure he was experiencing that and saying, not as bad as school recess, because that over-socialization was really bad. I'm sure that when he sneezed and made a spike pierce his eyeball, he said, a wedgie was way worse than this, because that really humiliated me. Among the most serious cruelties human beings can inflict on one another, did Unabomber just skip history class as he was flying through school as a math prodigy? Did they just let him skip all the history because it wasn't necessary to his ultimate goal, being a math professor? He keeps saying things that he doesn't like through all these examples. He's saying things that he doesn't like are the worst things ever with no historical context or any examples. Well, barely any examples that we'll get to, a few of them, but as vague as possible. Here's why he's doing it that way. It's to justify his crimes. He's saying that these other fluid challenges that the average normal person regularly faces are the worst things ever, to convince himself that his absolutely awful crimes are not so bad by comparison. So the jaywalking, being made to feel ashamed of jaywalking and being humiliated of yourself to snub someone, that's way worse than hiding away in a shack and mailing bombs to innocent people and ruining their lives. No, that's how socialization works. You're supposed to take those bad feelings and use that to adjust your behavior to get along with people. It's not one of the more serious cruelties that we can inflict on each other, and it's certainly nowhere near what Unabomber did in his crimes. So what he actually did was way, way, I feel silly even saying how much lower it is than what he's criticizing. But it's to make his crime seem not so awful. So now that we know why Unabomber thinks that way to justify his crimes, let's take a look at what he's actually saying, because in his opinion, what actually defines over socialization? Unabomber just says it's a person has been over socialized when they're made to feel bad about normal human behavior. So apparently Kaczynski left society too soon to learn the truth. Because again, he's projecting. He feels bad about everyday things, which is why he sought revenge through violence. He never learned, as I said in the beginning, how to overcome these everyday obstacles that most of us do to learn and mature. He never learned how to overcome those to become a normal member of society. So, since he feels bad about everyday things and never learned how to reconcile his absolutely awful thoughts that everyone has with being a normal, nice guy, he sought revenge through violence. That's the way that he dealt with the awful feelings that he never figured out how to deal with through his socialization. And as I covered in part one, the hypocrisy of his philosophy, he never wanted to free people. He was actually taking freedoms away through his surface agenda, which was freeing people from the bounds of economy and technology, which is actually limiting our options for survival. So he's not actually freeing people, he's taking freedoms away. He never cared about the consequences of industry because he was benefiting from them, getting all that money from his parents who earned it through industry. Building his shack and all of his worldly means of survival came from technology and industry. So he didn't care about the consequences of industry, he was contributing to them. He just wanted to feel better about himself, period. It's each individual's responsibility to use their own socialization as a tool to shape their life. Mick Foley, in his autobiography, Have a Nice Day, he used his shameful embarrassments as a fuel that led to a successful career. So instead of hiding away from society and saying we should destroy everything because he was made to feel embarrassed on a few significant occasions, he said, how can I make money off of creating this feeling in other people? These things I do get a good reaction. How can I make money off of that reaction? And Mick Foley did. He made a successful career that he could retire on in his 30s from using those shameful experiences. That's a positive way to use your socialization and to be a successful career and a valuable member of society. Murderers like Unabomber and Chris Watts are too stupid to figure that out, too cowardly to ask for help, and too impatient to acquire those attributes naturally through experience. They just want everything now because, as I alluded to earlier, mentally and emotionally, they're still babies. They would rather smash that ship in the bottle because it's way easier to do that than it is to have the skill and perseverance to actually build that miniature ship in a bottle. It's easier to just, yeah, I got what I wanted right away. Man, I don't have to do anything else now. Because maybe, same thing with Chris Watts and Grant Amato, who I already did the true crime series on. High IQs. Chris Watts was 140, Grant Amato was probably higher, and now we got Unabomber, who's the highest IQ of any monster that we know of in modern times. And mentally and emotionally, they're still just babies who would rather smash that ship in the bottle because it's easier than dealing with the frustration of learning a skill to actually build that miniature ship in the bottle. A mindless rock can fall from the sky and wipe out civilization in a day. There's nothing special about destruction. So, in case you're not convinced that Unabomber is just projecting with everything he criticizes is just a projection of himself, he finally gives an example to illustrate his point. Remember, I've been saying he doesn't give any examples. He gives rarely he gives examples. And here's one of the rare examples that he actually gives to support his thesis, which his example of a hypothetical man just completely undercuts everything he's been saying and should be absolutely no surprise to anyone with a brain. It's an example, as we've seen through everything I've covered, of the only person Unabomber thinks about, the only person he cares for, himself. This hypothetical man. Notice I didn't say the only person he understands, because he doesn't understand himself. That googly eye never turned all the way around and to look into his own brain. It just got stuck going that way, so that when he looks at one thing, he's seeing something else and describing that instead of what he's looking at. It should have continued all the way around to look at himself, because this is subconscious. He's subconsciously describing himself. And this hypothetical man he describes is the longest quote that I've read so far, because I can't do it justice by summarizing it. So let me just read the whole thing word for word. Consider a hypothetical man who can have anything he wants by wishing for it. This man has power but will develop serious psychological problems. At first, he will have a lot of fun, but then he will become acutely bored and demoralized. Eventually, he will become clinically depressed. This shows that power is not enough. And to just summarize more of what he says, he's basically saying that we all need goals. Power is not enough, so we need goals. Wow, what a genius. Isn't that the same thing that every decent teacher says to every student? Having fun isn't enough, kids. We need goals. Isn't that the same thing that every good parent says to their children? Yeah, fun is good for short-term satisfaction, but you need long-term goals for your long-term stability, kids. So, yeah, that makes sense. That is a true statement. But again, it's from a hypocritical place, because is there a better description, this hypothetical man, of the pampered math prodigy whose parents gave him everything he wanted? He lived a privileged lifestyle, by the way, through technology and industry that he hates. He was given everything he wanted and abused those opportunities, unlike his brother, who used that pampered upbringing from the same parents to become a smart, constructive contributor to society. So, Unabomber further misses the mark here through this example, which the quote by itself in a vacuum, like I said, it's what every good teacher says, it's what every good parent says to kids. So by itself in a vacuum is true, but the context he puts it in, his, not a historical context, not a sociological context, his context is just an embarrassing attempt to psychoanalyze history. Because he further goes on to write, history shows that leisure, secure aristocracies with no need to exert themselves usually become bored, hedonistic, and demoralized, even though they have power. And this one is just infuriating. Infuriating because he's speaking from a voice of authority as if there is no other option than to what he's saying. When it's because in the self-projection of this hypothetical man who would exist in this aristocracy, he was too stupid and lazy and became bored with his pampered lifestyle, that everything was provided for him. But that doesn't mean that it usually happens. The average human being who has learned and matured through their many hardships that they overcame is smart, motivated, valuable, and they use their leisure time to learn, develop, advance, and help others do the same. To drop a few historical names, Aristotle, Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, They used their leisure time and their own little personal aristocracies to help our species evolve, to give us the freedom of more survival options that Unabomber wanted to take away. Those people procured the future. That's what the average decent person, even if they have a low IQ, some high school dropout who's pumping gas at a gas station might have a half the IQ that Kaczynski does, but they are smarter with human intelligence than the math genius. It's the dumb, worthless blobs of molecules like Unabomber who become bored and hedonistic. So before we reveal the world of hypocrisy that is up at the glass ceiling where our current understanding of the universe doesn't even allow for anything bigger of hypocrisy than what I'm about to reveal, one more meager effort to present the opposition from the Unabomber, just to finish painting this picture. Because he does point out that some people, I would argue that it's most, some people in aristocracies use their time wisely, and he cites Emperor Hirohito, who used his leisure time to study biology and made advances in the field. But again, Unabomber oversimplifies this positive use of time as being little more than a surrogate goal, not necessary for survival, and ultimately unsatisfying, which is just on the border of blind. And it goes back to his absence of human intelligence, his failure to think outside of himself. The only reason any of us are here is because previous generations had high human intelligence. That's the real goal of aristocracies, is to prepare the world for future generations, to make everyday survival a non-issue so that we can procure the future. We can deflect that asteroid. We can reverse climate change. We can terraform other worlds to prepare them for future generations of humans that need to escape Earth. That is the goal of people with high human intelligence that think outside of themselves and make decisions based on the future that won't include them. That's the only reason any of us are here, and we're supposed to pay it forward. And it's people who never matured mentally or emotionally, are still babies, that don't see it that way. The average person does. So now let's get to it. The big one, the whole world, as we've seen through every example, every little island, Unabomber has been projecting his own faults onto what he criticizes. He is everything that he's been saying is wrong with society. He's been saying, to summarize everything I've covered, an over-socialized leftist is the worst type of person, right? And the Industrial Revolution is the worst time in human history. So, by Unabomber's own description, from his self-projection, he is the worst type of person in the worst time of history. So, if you agree with everything he writes, you must also be agreeing that he's the worst person ever. So, and if you do believe that he's the worst person ever, why would you believe anything he writes? He's the worst person ever. So I can't even come up with the words to express it any better. I want to keep saying it in different ways, but there's no better way. If you have taken this stuff to heart, if you're one of those, Unabomber predicted everything, Unabomber got it right, about his things that are one step above the end is near, just with bigger words and longer sentences. We all start out knowing nothing. We all must learn and mature. So it's an ongoing process. Have a nice day.